As we move on through the foundation concepts required for a sustainable career, the question that now tends to emerge is quieter and more personal. When the room is full and the stakes feel real, could the mechanism underneath actually carry what you have built? Or might it start to shake the moment you step into the light? It is one thing to design offers, refine programs, and organize your professional image. It is another to discover whether your own system can stay coherent when the hall goes silent and every gesture starts to matter. That moment tends to care far less about how polished your materials are. It asks whether the inner structure might support the outer ambition without collapsing into panic, blankness, or a kind of mechanical going through the motions. Just before you walk on stage, the triangle beneath your work, memory, posture, and flow, often feels suddenly exposed. The same system that functioned smoothly in the practice room now senses observation, evaluation, and risk. Stage fright wraps itself around that triangle as a fourth layer, amplifying arousal and directing the nervous system to treat a musical event as something potentially dangerous. The aim here is not to erase that surge, but to understand how it might be examined, reframed, and gradually turned into usable energy that supports precision and presence instead of undermining them. Approached this way, fear becomes part of the training ground rather than a verdict on your limits, and the system you have built in solitude may become increasingly capable of carrying your work under scrutiny. Over time, the charge of performance can begin to feel less like a hidden saboteur and more like a force your mechanism is prepared and even designed to hold. And confidence may start to feel like a property of that mechanism rather than a mood that disappears the moment pressure rises. The fourth layer of the mechanism. Stage fright can be viewed as an outer layer that presses against the triangle of memory, posture, and flow. Memory refers to how securely the material is encoded, posture to how the body is organized to execute it, and flow to the state that sometimes appears when those elements work together with some freedom. Stage fright does not replace any of these. It sits on top of them as the interface with the outside world. It is the point where audience, expectation, and perceived risk press against the structures you have built in the practice room. The same mechanism that feels coherent and stable alone can react very differently when it senses eyes, lights, and evaluation. In this frame, a polished program is not a guarantee that performance will feel the same under observation. If the nervous system has been trained mostly in isolation, it may read public exposure as a new and untested environment, even when the material is technically ready. Stage fright then becomes visible as shaking, blank moments, or a sense of watching yourself rather than simply playing. These reactions are not evidence of moral failure or lack of seriousness. They are signals about how much of your preparation might still depend on ideal conditions. When you treat stage fright as feedback rather than as a mysterious curse, it becomes something you can study with the same curiosity you bring to intonation or rhythm. Serious musicians often move forward by including this fourth layer in their understanding of the mechanism, asking how their system could be conditioned to tolerate different contexts without losing the foundations they have already built. The body under stress. When a performance is coded as risky, the shift usually begins in the brain before a single note is played. A structure called the amygdala continually scans for threat and might flag the situation as dangerous the moment it registers many eyes, high stakes, and limited room to withdraw. It tends not to distinguish clearly between physical and social danger, so exposure on stage can be treated as if it were a survival problem. Once activated, it engages the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares the body for action. Heart rate might rise, blood flow can shift toward larger muscle groups, digestion could slow, and stress hormones such as adrenaline may be released to mobilize energy quickly. On stage, These processes show up as sensations most musicians recognize. Increased muscle tone can produce tremors in the hands or legs, making fine control feel less accessible just when it is most needed. Breathing may become shallow or rapid, which interferes with support, phrasing, and timing. The mouth often dries as the body downregulates salivation, and attention can narrow toward what seems most critical: faces, lights, the edge of the stage, while broader awareness of form and acoustic space fades. None of this is actually aimed at sabotaging artistry. It is the nervous system attempting to protect you by preparing for immediate action. Understanding these reactions as survival mechanisms that are over-responding in a context that requires precision and nuance can soften the sense of personal failure. From that perspective, the task becomes less about blaming yourself for these sensations and more about learning how the system works so it could be gradually retrained to support rather than distort performance under pressure. The 3 F's of fear. When performance pressure rises, the nervous system could route that energy through one of 3 broad patterns, often described as fight, flee, and freeze. In a musical context, fight tends to appear as over-proving. Tempos drift faster than rehearsed, accents become harder, and gestures or expressions grow larger than the instrument or voice can comfortably support. The performer may feel compelled to demonstrate control rather than inhabit it, pushing dynamics to the edge of strain or crowding phrases with extra emphasis. Technique that was stable in rehearsal begins to fray because the system is spending bandwidth on display, not on efficient coordination. Flee tends to look more like avoidance than aggression, even when the body stays on stage. Attention sometimes retracts from the room, the colleagues, or the repertoire, and retreats into a narrow, self-protective tunnel. The player or singer might complete the program mechanically, avoiding eye contact, expressive risk, or any internal contact with the meaning of the music. Left unchecked, this pattern can erode memory and flow because the system quietly learns to survive by not fully showing up. Freeze appears when the system feels cornered. Fingers that have executed thousands of repetitions suddenly stall. The mind blanks on a familiar entry, or the breath catches just before a critical line. Muscles often co-contract in protective bracing, disrupting posture and fine motor control precisely when nuance is needed most. By contrast, a state of freedom does not necessarily involve less physiological charge. The same arousal may be acknowledged, organized, and carried by a trained mechanism instead of fought or fled. Breath patterns, alignment, and motor sequences that have been rehearsed under graduated doses of pressure can channel that energy into clearer articulation, steadier timing, and more saturated color. The performer senses activation, but does not interpret it as a verdict on their worth. It becomes fuel for focus and presence rather than a signal to escape or collapse. Seen this way, fight, flee, and freeze function less as fixed character traits and more as informative indicators of where support, conditioning, or structural change might be useful. The goal is not to eliminate these responses, but to understand them well enough that they can gradually yield to more flexible, supported states of performance. The triangle under fire. Stage fright tends to press against each side of the memory-posture-flow triangle at once. Heightened anxiety may load working memory with threat-related processing, self-evaluation, imagined audience reactions, and catastrophic predictions about mistakes. As that cognitive bandwidth is consumed, attention often narrows to the next bar, the next shift, or a single exposed entry, leaving less capacity to track larger forms. Shallow, surface-level memorization, finger sequences, or text learned without clear structural anchors often becomes particularly vulnerable to gaps or blanks under this pressure. When those gaps appear, the sense of threat can intensify, creating a feedback loop in which fear and memory lapses reinforce each other. The body usually participates in this loop through changes in posture. Some performers might collapse subtly, letting the chest sink, the head drop forward, and the axial support degrade, which can compromise breath, resonance, and hand balance. Others often brace. Shoulders lift, the jaw tightens, and peripheral muscles grip in an attempt to stabilize what feels unstable. Both patterns tend to interfere with efficient support and tone production, and they might shorten stamina by asking smaller muscles to do work better suited to deeper structures. Flow, meanwhile, often weakens as awareness swivels away from line, harmony, and ensemble toward constant self-monitoring. Instead of tracking phrase direction or acoustic response, the performer might track perceived flaws, audience micro-reactions, or internal commentary about how the performance is going. A well-built triangle does not prevent fear, but it can give that fear fewer places to hijack the mechanism. Deeper structural memory, forms, voice-leading, harmonic landmarks could provide multiple retrieval routes when surface sequences wobble, turning a potential blank into a brief rerouting. Practiced default alignment, rehearsed across varying levels of activation, often helps the body return more quickly to a functional baseline when it starts to brace or collapse. A cultivated habit of listening outward to line, harmony, and room response can offer flow channels that compete with self-surveillance and give the arousal somewhere constructive to go. Under those conditions, anxiety could retain its sharpness without automatically overwhelming the system, and each demanding event could become part of a larger picture of how the triangle holds when it matters, gradually feeding a quieter confidence in what the mechanism is capable of carrying. Training under real pressure. Resilience in performance rarely develops from low-stakes practice alone. It tends to grow when the memory posture flow triangle is asked to function under gradually increasing pressure. Deliberate run-throughs treated as real events, fixed start times, full programs, no stopping, begin to teach the system that it must carry structure, alignment, and continuity even as arousal rises. Small audiences, open lessons, studio classes, and informal house concerts can extend this conditioning by adding the element of being observed, with all the evaluative fantasies that often accompany it. Recording sessions, where every sound feels permanent, offer a related but distinct form of pressure that highlights different vulnerabilities in memory, tone production, and pacing. Within these environments, the performer can begin to watch how the triangle behaves instead of simply enduring the experience. It often becomes clearer where tension first appears in the body, which passages remain stable, and where the mind tends to contract into self-critique or lose contact with structural landmarks. Noting how recovery unfolds after a slip, whether the system can rejoin the form without spiraling, can be as informative as tracking where errors occur. This kind of observation does not require a rigid protocol. It asks only for curiosity about how the mechanism responds when conditions are less forgiving than the practice room. The same surge of activation that once felt like an unpredictable enemy might start to resemble a familiar landscape the mechanism has visited many times in smaller doses. Structural memory, posture, and flow are still tested, but they are tested along gradients the performer has already begun to explore and adjust. Under those conditions, anxiety may retain its sharpness without automatically overwhelming the system, and each demanding event could become part of a larger picture of how the triangle holds when it matters. Purpose, meaning, and quiet courage. Stage fright often tightens around the question, how am I being judged? And may use each physical sensation as potential evidence for or against the self. Reframing performance as an act of giving can begin to loosen that grip. When the focus shifts toward what is being offered, the contour of a phrase, the clarity of a text, the chance for an audience to encounter a particular work, the center of gravity may move from self-surveillance to delivery. The performer is still present and exposed, but the main concern becomes whether the music reaches people, whether the repertoire is treated with integrity, and whether a cultural or spiritual tradition is being served well. Under that orientation, the same arousal that once felt like a threat to identity can start to feel like energy available for communication. Simple, personal ways of orienting attention before playing or singing can help anchor this shift. A short period of silence, a moment of reflection on why the program matters, a quiet prayer, or a remembered phrase that names the purpose of the work can all function as cues to reconnect the mechanism with what it is there to do. Confidence in this frame is less a feeling of invulnerability and more a possible coherence between inner values and outer action. The sense that one's preparation and intentions align with what is about to occur on stage. Courage then becomes the decision to stand in that coherence, even when fear is present, allowing nerves and meaning to coexist rather than waiting for anxiety to vanish. This kind of quiet courage may not erase stage fright, but it can keep the performance oriented towards service rather than self-judgment. Conclusion. Stage fright may be understood less as a mysterious fate and more as the combined response of body and brain to perceived danger pressing on the triangle of memory, posture, and flow. When arousal rises, it tends to press on all three sides at once, testing how well structure holds, how alignment organizes, and how attention moves. If fear is treated as a fixed verdict on one's nature, those tests can feel punitive and arbitrary. When it is approached instead as a parameter that might be observed and trained, each episode of anxiety becomes information about how the mechanism currently behaves under load and where it might need reinforcement. From that perspective, performances, lessons, and recording sessions could begin to feel less like final verdicts and more like opportunities to observe how the system responds under pressure. The outer structures developed through the gig magnet system, artistic clarity, robust offers, a coherent public image, and a deliberate repertoire frame tend to gain strength when the internal chassis is willing and able to carry arousal without fragmenting. Over time, work on memory, posture, and flow can intersect with a deeper search for artistic maturity and identity, so that fear gradually ceases to be the primary organizer of experience and is replaced by a clearer sense of who is playing and why, and by a form of confidence rooted in that clarity rather than in the absence of nerves. Understanding stage fright in this way does not make it vanish, but it can help it be worked through the system rather than left lodged at its center. In that ongoing process, nerves may lose much of their authority over what is possible and become one more source of intensity the mechanism is increasingly prepared to hold in service of the work.